Hello, everybody. My name is Rafael Zawisza. I represent the University of Warsaw, and I'm really pleased to be here, even though I joined you only just at the moment, just today, and I really regret that I didn't hear all the previous presentations. But now I have a great pleasure and honor to chair this session. It's better now? Yes? It's okay? Thanks. So we have 3 presentations, and I will present them as they are ordered, and then we'll start, and as far as I've heard, the discussion will be afterwards, after the 2 presentations. So the first one is Ville Suuronen from Jyväskylä University from Finland, and the title of his presentation is The Paradoxes in Arendt's Account of Modernity. Then we'll have Nataliia Aniskevich from St. Petersburg, Russia, with the paper Hannah Arendt's Conceptions in Terms of Latin American Military Dictatorship. And as a third, we have a presentation by Mika, Ojakangas, the same Finland, the same university, and the paper is entitled Arendt's Twofold Concept of Modernity. So I invite you to present and then to the discussion. The floor is yours, Ville.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. Guten Tag. Yeah, so I actually changed the title of my presentation to another one, which is a bit more poetic, I hope. So I entitled this presentation Between Tragedies and Promises, the Paradoxical Modernity in Hannah Arendt's Political Thought. Excuse me, the Multifaceted and Paradoxical Modernity in Arendt's Thought. So let's begin. Hannah Arendt's understanding and concept of modernity has been one of the most debated issues concerning her political thought. The early reception of her work was characterized by what Sheila Ben-Habib has termed as the nostalgic standard interpretation. Arendt was often understood as a nostalgic thinker who presents a straightforwardly negative picture of modernity and remains attached to a conception of politics inspired by the classical Greek polis. However, this interpretation has been criticized and problematized by several commentators who have emphasized that Arendt must be interpreted beyond her arguably pessimistic magnum opus, The Human Condition. Further, some commentators have read Arendt's work as a critically Nietzschean and Heideggerian attempt to overcome the basic problems of Western political philosophy and as an attempt to formulate a late modern understanding of political action by drawing on Immanuel Kant's third critique. So, drawing on this interpretational background, in this paper I distinguished 3 different ways in which Arendt systematically applies, implies, and understands the concept of modernity. First, Arendt's narratives concerning the rise of totalitarianism and increasing world alienation are tragic. Second, at the same time, Arendt envisions the possibility of a new kind of post-nation-state politics based on a geopolitical alternative, federations and council systems that represent a promise inherent in all political action rooted in natality. Third, Arendt also has a philosophical account of modernity. Following Martin Heidegger, her philosophical teacher, she diagnoses an end of metaphysics and seeks to develop a new political philosophy of human plurality suitable for a politics of the global age. So, in what follows, I will interpret these 3 different lines of interpretation in Hannah Arendt's thought. Let us begin with Arendt's tragical account of Western modernity. Arendt's tragic account of modernity is most clearly visible in her claim that totalitarianism constitutes an entirely novel form of government. According to her, none of the classical taxonomies that classify different forms of government, whether provided by Plato, Aristotle, or Montesquieu, are able to grasp the radical novelty of totalitarian government. In seeking to augment Montesquieu's famous threefold classification of governments, Arendt asserts that the essence of totalitarianism is terror and its principle of movement, ideology. As Arendt puts it in her reply from 1953 to Erik Voegelin's review of the origins of totalitarianism, totalitarian domination was an unprecedented event born out of a crystallization of many different causes and roots into a new horrendous singularity. For Arendt, Nazism is equal with the radical negation of any tradition that amounts to a breakdown of all German and European traditions, the good as well as the bad. However, Arendt's work on totalitarianism was both a historical diagnosis and a political warning. Most of the singular causes that contributed to the rise of totalitarianism, ideologies, anti-Semitism, imperialism, loneliness, and the lack of meaningfulness, for example, did not disappear from history at the same time as totalitarian governments did, but only lost their most radical form of realization. And building on this, also the human condition can be read as an attempt to deal with the problem of totalitarianism and the tragedies of modern politics from a more ontologically and historically oriented point of view. In this work, Arendt traces the origins of modern world alienation, its twofold flight from the earth into the universe and from the world into the self, as she herself puts it. According to Arendt's famous account, in the modern world, labor has become the central factor of human lives, from which we as human beings derive nearly all meaningfulness. In contrast to all earlier ages, we have come to glorify labor. The animal laborance of modern times has lost the higher activities as well as the common world between human beings. Secularization and the rise of the social lead to the destruction of the sensus communis, of shared values, perceptions, customs, and habits. What we are left with is a fragmented reality in which all of the great narratives threaten to gradually lose their fundamental meaning as guideposts. Okay, this is the account of Arendt and modernity, which everyone knows, basically. However, Arendt never claimed that modern world alienation and the ensuing downfall of the sensus communis would simply destroy the basis of all future politics. In fact, Arendt's claim is, in a certain sense, the very opposite. In addition to her tragic narrative, Arendt also presents a parallel depiction of Western history. This is the story of modern revolutions as new political beginnings and the history of council systems as another new form of political organization. Arendt maintains that the story of modern revolutions is in fact the innermost story of the modern age. Beyond her well-known reflections on the American and French revolutions, what still remains poorly known amongst Arendt scholars is that all of her oeuvre is defined by a critically republican appraisal of the radically democratic council system as a form of political organization. So this council system, or Rätesystem, Rätedemokrati, Arendt utilizes all of these terms. It appeared spontaneously as a form of grassroots democracy during the Parisian Commune of 1871, in the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, in Germany and Austria after World War I, and during the short-lived Hungarian Revolution of 1956. In fact, and intentionally dismissing its Marxist background, Arendt saw the council system as the only modern democratic alternative to the multi-party system, one that had not been properly tested and which, as Arendt says, was discredited even before it came to existence. These revolutionary events display how natality and human spontaneity are combined with concrete new political beginnings and with the striving to institutionalize political freedom. Throughout her different political writings, Arendt envisions a politics based on council systems on the domestic front and various kinds of federations on the international level. In what follows, I will take up some examples for this political advocation, if one could call it as such. First of all, in her early political essays, which deal with the Jewish-Palestinian question, Arendt proposes and supports the creation of a Near East Federation and a Mediterranean Federation. With a critical distance to the proposal of Judah Magnes, Arendt speculates on the possibility of a Jewish-Arab local councils and supports the creation of a binational state in Palestine that could function as a stepping stone toward a larger federated structure in the Middle East. Arendt's early support for various grassroots democracy models is also highlighted by the fact that for her, the greatest part of the Jewish homeland were the locally governed kibbutzim. The second example is that from 1940 onwards, Arendt constantly speculates on the possibility of forming a European federation. On few occasions, she also speculates on the possibility of forming an Atlantic community. The third of these examples is that of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. It was this true event, as Arendt calls it, which led her to seriously consider radical grassroots democracy and the council system as a reviable form of political organization for the future. Arendt states that the events of 1956 in Hungary allow us to draw a sketchy picture of the potentialities and physiognomy of the council systems as a distinctive form of government. Its political organization was defined by a horizontal construction of power through the grassroots of the people. Different levels of councils and a gradation of authorities eventually leading to a supreme national council. The members of these councils were not representing parties but were chosen as individuals. According to Arendt, the constant reappearance of these councils represents the fact that such grassroots democracy seems to correspond to the basic coordinates of political action itself. So we will move on to the last example. Fourth, throughout her life, Arendt remained really enthusiastic about the United States as a federated political body. In an especially interesting entry to her thought diary, or to her Denktagebuch, Arendt refers to the United States as the first country, and this is a quote, where foreign politics became domestic politics. In fact, here lies an instruction for a political organization of the entire humanity. As a replacement of national sovereignty, Arendt envisions a world that would be constituted of several federate units, leading to an international community in which political power would remain, I quote, horizontally directed so that the federated units mutually check and control the power of others. In The Human Condition, Arendt describes this transformation of political organization after what she calls the decline of the European nation-state system as a general process in which mankind now begins to replace nationally bound societies and the earth replaces the limited state territory. The development of mankind into a factually existing political entity made it necessary and possible, so Arendt argues, to develop a new political principle that would encompass the whole of humanity and potentially could guarantee the right to have rights to every single human being. And these are quotations from the preface to The Origins of Totalitarianism. Okay, and we will move on to the third form of modernity that appears in Arendt's writings, that is the philosophical account of modernity. Okay, so what? I'm in the middle? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so beyond her tragic narrative and her appraisal of modern revolutionary events, Arendt also has a philosophical account of modernity. Which I find from here. Many of her writings from the Many of her writings from the early 1950s also demonstrate how she begins to develop the basic contours of her own political philosophy based on the concept of human plurality. Arendt's reflections begin with the Tocquevillian notion that since the past has ceased to throw its light upon the future, the mind of man wanders in obscurity, and with the following realization that a new political science is needed for a world itself quite new. This is a quotation which Arendt often utilizes, and it's from the Tocqueville's famous work on the democracy in America. Like Hegel, Nietzsche, and most of all her teacher Heidegger before her, Arendt too affirms what is now often termed as the end of metaphysics in philosophical discussions. The modern implausibility of the originally Platonic idea of a suprasensory realm allows us, Arendt maintains, to look on the past with new eyes. In her posthumously published essay entitled Socrates from the early 1950s, Arendt writes, "If philosophers were ever to arrive at a true political philosophy, they would have to make the plurality of man, out of which arises the whole realm of human affairs, in its grandeur and its misery, the object of their Taumatsein, or of their reflections." At the same time, in her Denktagebuch, Arendt raises the fundamental question that thereafter defines all of her later studies on political history and political theory. What is politics? Arendt claims that philosophy and theology have never answered this fundamental question concerning politics in an adequate manner, because they have primarily dealt with the human being in the singular rather than the human beings in their plurality. Arendt mentions two major reasons for this state of affairs. First of all, the Aristotelian conception of the human being as tum politikon, that falsely implies that there would be something fundamentally and essentially political in human beings themselves. Second, the monotheistic understanding of God and the closely related conception of the human being as the image of God. From this point of view, human beings are falsely understood as self-sufficient creatures, resulting in a conception of lonely individuals waging a Hobbesian war of all against all. Contrary to these traditional assertions, according to Arendt, politics is based on the fact of human plurality, and politics is a matter of being together and associating with other unique individuals. There is nothing essentially political in human beings. Politics takes place only between human beings, and it is possible only among a plurality of humans, which is to say that politics can only exist outside of the singular human being. For this reason, Arendt writes, there is no political substance. The important thing is that politics must be understood as a relationship between individuals who come and act together for a common interest. So now to end these reflections and to deliver a short summary of these three different tendencies and implications of modernity in Arendt's thought, I would like to make a short summary, and I would like to argue for the fundamental paradoxality of Arendt's account. Arendt best describes this paradoxality in her 1954 foreword to the origins of totalitarianism. This is a long quotation, but please bear with me. The trouble is that our period has so strangely intertwined the good with the bad, that without the imperialist expansion for the expansion's sake, the world might have never become one. Without the bourgeoisie's political device of power for power's sake, the extent of human strength might never have been discovered. Without the fictitious world of totalitarian movements, in which, with unparalleled clarity, the essential uncertainties of our time have been spelled out, we might have never been driven to our doom without ever becoming aware of what has been happening. And if it is true that in the final stages of totalitarianism an absolute evil appears, absolute because it can no longer be deduced from humanly comprehensible motives, it is also that without it we might have never known the truly radical nature of evil. What Arendt articulates in this relatively short passage is decisive for a proper understanding of her political thought. In fact, all of Arendt's most important analyses concerning modernity proceed from the conviction that historical developments are never one-sided. The fundamental paradox that lies at the heart of Arendt's understanding of Western political and philosophical modernity is that the unprecedented event par excellence of the 20th century, that of totalitarian domination, not only forces us to reconsider our understanding of politics and human existence from an entirely fresh point of view, but indeed liberates us in doing so. Despite the fact that totalitarian domination was an event that showed the absolute worst of which human beings are capable of, it also brutally demonstrated, and I quote Arendt's words, that the power of man is so great that he can really be what he wishes to be. It was the resulting conviction that historically we know of man's nature only insofar as it has existence, which led Arendt to rethink the theoretical basis of politics against the Western tradition of thought. This fundamental paradoxality that penetrates all of her different analyses of modernity is clearly expressed in her 1954 essay, Tradition and the Modern Age. Even though Arendt contends that after World War II, Western culture and civilization seem to be but a field of ruins, she immediately adds that even though this state of affairs may look deplorable, implicit in it is the great chance to look upon the past with eyes undistracted by any tradition, with a directness which has disappeared from Occidental reading and hearing ever since Roman civilization submitted to the authority of Greek thought. That's a quotation. Yeah, so does Arendt's account of modernity end in an impasse to a mere contradictory account of different tendencies? I don't think so. When writing on Karl Marx, for her the last of the great political philosophers of the Western tradition, Arendt herself once noted that fundamental and flagrant contradictions rarely occur in second-rate writers. In the work of great authors, they lead to the very center of their work. One is indeed tempted to say that this same dictum simply applies to Arendt herself. However, I think that this would be a misunderstanding. Arendt herself understands history in a fundamentally different manner than Marx does. For her, history is a series of caesuras, ruptures and breaks. History is a story which has many beginnings but no end. And it is not a Hegelian process as it is for Marx. As a consequence of this difference, the major tensions in Arendt's work don't appear as contradictions but as paradoxes. Since Arendt presupposes that history itself can have no definite goal, she is also forced to contend that major historical events always illuminate human existence and history in a multifaceted manner. With critical distance to Nietzsche, Arendt asserts that the illumination of history itself depends on perspective and opinion. Hannah Arendt was not... To end this, I will quote Sheila Ben-Habib once again. I think we should understand Sheila Ben-Habib's well-formulated statement that modernity for Hannah Arendt was not a seamless historical development, but a process rich in contradictions in a much more radical manner than Ben-Habib herself does. The major tensions in Arendt's work are not the contradictions between her various and different works, but the paradoxes that lie at the very core of her style of writing and at the heart of her understanding of modernity. Arendt's political theory reminds us that when we orient ourselves in the present and toward the future by relying on historical narratives and events, we are free to choose between the tragedies and promises of the past. She reminds us that as long as there is a possibility to act, there is hope of a different future. As Augustine said and Arendt concurred, initium ut esse homo creatus est, that a beginning be made, man was created. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now we are switching to the second presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody, or guten Tag, it's all what I know in Germany. My name is Nataliia Aniskevich, or you can remember me like Natasha from Russia. I'm a PhD student of Institute for Latin America, Russian Academy of Science, and you will see what I did. Hannah Arendt adhered to the idea that we must think over what we do. She believes that the central characteristic of any society is a balance between publicity and privacy, and the violation of the harmonious correlation between these spheres deforms the normal course of human right. But in her essays or books, she just wrote about Europe, about Second World War, and he didn't write anything about Latin America. But I think it's a big region. This region has a big history, and we can draw a parallel between the work of Arendt on violence, was published in 1969, and the events that occurred in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. From Arendt's work, I take her dear line on the surface of this essay. She opposed their traditional understanding of power and an ability to achieve the goal, and contrasted such two concepts like power and violence. She also conceptually divided some definition like strength, force, and authority. And I will talk about terror too, because she says that terror is a form of government established when violence, destroying all power, retains full control. What happened in Latin America, because they had a lot of dictatorship, military through the Latin America. There's dictatorship. They did a lot for economy, but they didn't anything for society inside of these countries. And what Arendt talked about these main conceptions, the power for Arendt corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power never belongs to an individual, it belongs to a group and exists only as long as group keeps together. When the group disappears from which power takes place, the power itself disappears. What is characteristic in this definition? There is no theology, only a pure joint being. It does not need to be justified, it needs to be legitimacy. And strength point to something individual, a property inherent in the character of the person, capable of manifesting in relation to other things or person, but not dependent on them. Force is one of these words she used like synonym for coercive violence, but in different way. For Arendt, that was the destination of energy produced by physical or social movements. Authority, its main feature is the unconditional recognition on the part of those whom they demand obedience. Authority provides obedience while preserving freedom. And violence is instrumental in nature. It is close to the conception of power since it serves to increase natural power. It is a mean and therefore should be used by someone for something. But when it's enough to be violence, you have a lot of power, you don't think about what happened inside of your country somewhere. These leaders found for them a new way to be the first in the country, that is terror. And what about military regimes in Latin America? It was at late 70s, early 80s. They was in Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile. That was so sad time for Latin America. It was the same example like with Soviet Union, because a lot of people was killed, not just from this country, but from foreigners' country. And for example, in Argentina, they're looking for some, they had some society of grandparents who are looking for their neighbors, because they had a protest in the main square in Buenos Aires, and government take their daughters who were pregnant and steal their children. And they're looking for these children now. That is a big memory, and they can keep together all nations. And these leaders, they used power, force, and authority. They were, but they use in another way with their using of terror. And I want to talk more about Pinochet's military regime because I'm studying Chile. It's more close for me. And I want to notice that everybody, not everybody, a lot of people, I think it's old population, they still love Pinochet. They were crying when he died. It's like a cult. For them, it's something interesting because he killed a lot of people. He did a lot of bad things, but at that time, economy of this country was the best. Was one of the best in Latin America, and maybe if we think about about economy now in Chile, before that was better than now. And what about Pinochet? In 1974, he declares that he is the main leader, the president of this republic, and all power in their hand and in his hand. In 1874, he created secret policy, and that like a fact. In the secret policy was working, I think, 15,000 of people, and they killed and steal a lot of people. Somebody can't find their relative now, and I don't know, it's like unofficial information that was killed and still around 30,000 of people around the Chile, but not from Chile, how I told it, from other countries too. Like, he didn't give freedom for a lot of people, like for scientists, for government parties, because he wanted to do everything by themselves. And in 1881, he created a new constitution and started to be president at 8 years. Can you imagine now that president can be 8 years without any restriction? He can do everything. And that started, he did mistake at that time because in the next 2 years was a stagnation and decline of their economic, and people in different political parties started to think that they need to change something, but he didn't do it, and they did just at 1988 when they had a referendum, and that was official referendum. That was a mistake of Pinochet, and 35% of people was voted for another person, for not him, and he started to be just military general for next 2 years. And when they had peaceful revolution inside of their country, because that's not like with a lot of blood and different things, they were migrate to another country, and his era was ended, but he had a lot of influence inside of Latin America, and we can say that he has power, he has strength, he has force, and he has authority inside of country. But he used violence, and when he didn't find another way to be the first, and he started to use terror. That was their mistake. Arendt talked about that the terror is the last stop for some revolution. And he did this mistake. And what about everything if we will draw a parallel between essay of Hannah's work on violence and what happened in Latin America in historic way, we can say that the creative potential of the authorities is actualized in the case of ensuring and guaranteeing human rights, creating conditions for an optimal balance between public and private achieving freedom. Violence is a phenomenon not connected with power in the necessary way, although it can be one of the instruments of political activity. Power is creative by nature, violence is destructive, and terror after too. And the last one, a very significant factor in limiting violence in real politics is legitimacy, the support of power by uncontrolled individuals. It is with this in the long term that the process of strengthening the integrity and stability of society are linked. And thank you for your attention. Danke.
Thank you very much. So now we have the presentation of Professor Mika Ojakangas.
Thank you. It's 20 minutes.
Yes, it's 20 minutes.
Okay.
And a little bit more, because we saved.
So,
A little bit more, because we saved.
so how does it work? Okay. Yeah. What in here? All right. Okay, the title of my paper has changed a bit, because I'm talking about Arendt's concept of modernity, but I'm reflecting of her concept of modernity through the concept of conscience, and the reason is that a couple of years ago I published a book on the history of conscience, and this is a part of it. As a student of Heidegger, it's not a surprise that Hannah Arendt wrote quite extensively about conscience. It occupied a central place already in her dissertation on Augustine, written at the end of 1920s. Here Arendt depicted the Augustinian conscience as something that puts man coram deo into the presence of God. Conscience is the voice of divine law and opposed to the world insofar as it directs man beyond the world and away from the worldly habits and habituation. In the 1960s, she took up the same theme, but now in order to elaborate a concept of conscience of her own. Although Arendt still thought that conscience is opposed to habits and habituation, or for Arendt it is an element which radically disturbs the established order of things. For her, conscience is now a side effect of thinking process. Thinking itself, for Arendt, is a silent intercourse with oneself, and thus a dual process implying a divided subject or two in one, as Arendt puts it. Whereas conscience is a kind of knowledge actualized in every thinking process. The most probable reason why Arendt returned to the theme of conscience in the 1960s relates to the atrocities of the Second World War, and more broadly speaking to the question of evil these atrocities had made extremely acute. This subject remains also at the heart of Arendt's last major work, The Life of the Mind. At the beginning of the book, Arendt asks, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come, to pass, or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing or even actually condition them against it? The first volume of the book is an extensive attempt to answer this particular question. The conclusion is a little bit ambitious. I quote Arendt. The manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge. It is the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly, and this at the rare moments when the stakes are on the table may indeed prevent catastrophes, at least for the self." End of quote. In other words, thinking conscience, I call it thinking conscience, which indeed names the ability to tell the right from wrong, may prevent personal catastrophes or evil doing, and it may do so because conscience is either a negative afterthought roused by one's bad deeds or the anticipation of such afterthoughts. Thus, conscience concerns the self alone, preventing it at least from such wrongdoing which the self conceives as the cause of negative afterthoughts disturbing the peace of the soul. On the other hand, Arendt also states here that conscience may prevent catastrophes at the rare moments when the stakes are on the table. What does this mean? I think it relates to Arendt's insight that the thinking conscience remains a marginal affair in society except in so-called boundary situation. And I quote Arendt, "In times of crisis, when, so to speak, we found ourselves with our back against the wall," these are boundary situations. Arendt attributes the term boundary or limit situation to Karl Jaspers, who, as he claims, coined it. And we know for Jaspers, limit situations are existential situations such as death, suffering, conflict, chance, and guilt. According to Jaspers, moreover, all human existence necessarily involves facing these situations, and man becomes truly conscious of himself as man by facing them. In Arendt's view, they are particularly in such limit situations that conscience becomes operative. For Arendt, however, limit situations are more than mere psychological conditions. They also denote emergencies. I quote Arendt, "The thinking ego and its experience conscience remains a marginal affair for society at large except in emergencies." Emergency is not, I think, it's not a psychological but rather a political notion or a juridical notion, and I think it refers to what Carl Schmitt famously calls the state of exception, based on the sovereign decision which, normatively speaking, emanates from nothingness, as Schmitt says. It is in such emergencies that conscience leaves the margins of society and enters at its heart, and as Arendt writes, conscience is itself a kind of emergency measure. Thus, not unlike the Schmittian sovereign decision, which, emanating from the normative nothingness, decides on emergency measures during the state of exception, the Arendtian conscience gives life a measure during the times of crisis, when all laws and customs are held in abeyance, preventing and eventually defining evil, because the law is not capable of doing it, either because it is suspended or it doesn't exist at all. Now, given the fact that on February 28, Adolf Hitler proclaims the decree for the protection of the people and the state, which suspended the articles of the Weimar Constitution concerning personal liberties, it would have been consistent if Arendt had seen the Third Reich as a clear manifestation of the state of exception, in which the conscience becomes operative. Instead of that, however, the National Socialist Germany represented for Arendt a collapse of morality into, I quote, into a mere set of mores. In other words, the Third Reich was not one of those rare moments when the stakes are on the table, but rather a normal situation in which people lead their lives without thinking and hence without actualizing their consciences. In this respect, the National Socialist Germany was not radically different from other modern societies, as Arendt insists that morality is collapsed into a mere set of empty mores in modernity as a whole, particularly because the individuals of modern mass societies are normalized by a number of rules imposed by the anonymous machinery of aggressive administration. Modern man is not a man of thought and conscience, but a thoughtless being repeating trivial truths. Thoughtlessness, the heedless recklessness or hopeless confusion of complacent repetition of truths, which have become trivial and empty, seems to me among the outstanding characteristics of our time. Thus, Nazi Germany is not an exception, but rather a paradigm of modern society, which almost by definition lacks both thinking and conscience. This is, I think, a plausible interpretation, but perhaps it's not the whole truth. Arendt also asserts that the modern world is defined by the loss of rules and standards. The loss of standards defines the modern world in its facticity and cannot be reversed by any sort of return to the good old days or by some arbitrary promulgation of new standards and values. In other words, modernity is an epoch of conformity and that of emergency at the same time. It's an epoch of normality and a state of exception. Is there then a contradiction in Arendt's conception of modernity? Perhaps not. Arendt might have thought that the anonymous administration of the modern mass society imposes rules and standards, although metaphysically speaking, such rules and standards are already impossible. I quote Arendt, "God is dead, at least the traditional thought of God, and thus all the rules and standards are necessarily arbitrary, and consequently all the attempts to present them as something more than that are absolutely illegitimate." If this holds true, modernity, Nazi period including, is indeed an epoch of a state of exception in which the center cannot hold, but meaningless administration draws a veil over this truth by inventing rules and standards that have no grounds whatsoever. This would also make comprehensible why Arendt never says that conscience enters the center state in modernity, despite the loss of standards. The loss of standards arouses thinking process, which then renders conscience operative, but in modern mass society, the loss of standards has remained unnoticed because of repetition of trivial and empty truths. And thus, in order to render conscience operative again, we must disclose, this is what I think Arendt thinks, we must disclose the emptiness of these truths and unveil the truth that God is dead and the loss of standards defines the modern world in its facticity. According to Arendt, I think, it is our duty to do so, because such a disclosure alone makes us capable of telling right from wrong in the first place. It is not, I quote Arendt, it is not a law given from outside, be it the law of God or the laws of men, end of quote, that gives us the capacity to judge. On the contrary, it is the absence of such laws and ultimately the absence of all standards that makes us morally and politically mature being. This destruction of standards has a liberating effect on another human faculty, the faculty of judgment, which one may call, with some justification, the most political of man's mental abilities. It is the faculty of judge particulars without subsuming them under those general rules which can be taught and learned until they grow into the habits that can be replaced by other habits and rules. Now, according to Arendt, we usually call such a situation without standards, nihilism. In this sense, nihilism is, for Arendt, the condition of possibility of all ethics and politics. But Arendt doesn't call it nihilism, neither Heidegger. In her view, nihilism is not a situation in which the standards have collapsed, but on the contrary, it is, and it was, as it was for Martin Heidegger, a situation in which people conform to the standards. Nihilism is conformism, and habituation, whereas an authentic ethical political decision emanates from the very absence of customs, opinions, laws, standards, from the two-in-one of the soundless dialogue actualizing a difference within our identity, difference called conscience. And the end of my paper, I have a little bit controversial quotation here, but we can discuss about it. Don't shoot me. Yet, a disturbing fact is that also the Nazis glorified conscience. In a speech to the SS groups at Poznan on October 4th, 1943, even Heinrich Himmler states that the virtue of SS man does not consist of obedience for the sake of rules and authorities, but for the sake of conscience. Actually, Himmler says, the only authority an SS soldier ought to have is the voice of his conscience. It will not always be possible to verify whether the order has been carried out. With us, the verification must never be left to a commissar as it is in Russia. The only commissar we have is our own conscience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three speakers, and now I invite you to pose the questions.
I have a question for the first speaker. You identified three aspects of Hannah Arendt's political philosophy: world alienation, council system, and the end of metaphysics. And you argue that the term tragic only applies to the first and not to the second and third. But I would suggest that it applies to the second and third because through the council system appeared and reappeared over the course of each and every revolution, but it was destroyed by the nation-state system and by the modern political party system. And we can never be certain that it will come back again. It also applies, the term tragic also applies, doesn't it, to the end of metaphysics, because we can no longer explain the world, understand the world in terms of the old certainties. We can never put the blame on God, on religion, on das Geist, world history. Everything is our, own doing. Isn't that tragic?
Thank you for that question. That's really well formulated. But I still have to disagree with you on both. It's true that you could call it tragic. Arendt obviously makes this parallel between the appearance of the nation state and the appearance of the council system, and presents this as a sort of a battle which ends up with the victory of the nation state. But that was not the whole point in my presentation. The whole point was basically to find such lines of interpretation which are not merely tragic. I think the note with which she writes on those council systems is a hopeful one. I mean, there's this famous interview which is also printed at the end of The Crisis of the Republic, Thoughts on Politics and Revolution. And she says that she's not hopeful that one could ever institutionalize these council systems or federations. Or it's really unlikely that that will happen. But then she says that perhaps this will, who knows, happen with the next revolution. The important thing for her is not the fact that we have lost, as she herself always quoted this sentence from Cato. I can't pronounce Latin really well, but she was more pleased with the ones who were defeated than with the ones who won. So in this sense, my point was on the accent of her writing and not in the historical analysis itself. In terms of the second part, then it's simply no. It's not tragic at all. For her, like Mika explained in his presentation as well, like this possibility to think without banisters, to think without these artificial crutches of the tradition, without religion, without customs, this is an unforeseen possibility for her. And yeah, like you emphasized, the human being from an Arendtian perspective, I think, only becomes maturely human in this modern situation. So even though from a purely linguistic point of view, I could agree with your usage of the term tragic, then I still have to disagree for these reasons that I have elaborated here.
So two questions. The first is a kind of a follow-up on the first question is a kind of a follow-up on the last question. I didn't really get why you present the different stories about modernity by Arendt as contradictory or in tension. I mean, modernity is an abstraction. Obviously, it's such a huge historical process. It would include a lot of different tendencies. And it seems to me that all the different trajectories Arendt takes are actually complementary. I mean, if part of the reason of the rise of totalitarianism is the atomization and depolitization of society, obviously you need to create. Can you hear me? You seem like
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
At least partially.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if it's one reason for the rise of totalitarianism, you need to repoliticize society. And what better way would be to do that if not to create participatory democracy in the form of a citizen council system? And if the tradition of political thought made us be hostile to politics and did not really help us understand what politics means, maybe you need to lay new groundwork, theoretical groundwork for participatory democracy. So you need to question the tradition and so on. So these different themes seem to be, to me, complementary rather than contradictory. I hope that was clear. The second question is for Natasha. I just want to say, first of all, that it's fascinating. I told you that before. It's fascinating, the connection between Hannah Arendt and Latin America. Very little has been written about that, if at all. I would just suggest that, I mean, I know that you try to think about Latin America through Arendt, but it might be interesting to think about Arendt through Latin America. I told you before that it's very interesting. It seems that she was very ignorant about what was going on in Latin America. She said, well, what is taking place there is horrible, but it's not our fault. Not our fault, the United States, in Latin America in the 60s and 70s, which is kind of ignorant. It sounds like sheer ignorance. On the other hand, your talk got me thinking, she was a reader of Noam Chomsky. I mean, she read at least some of his books. If you read Noam Chomsky in the 1960s and 70s, you cannot be ignorant about Latin America. You might disagree with his analysis. So I just think that it might be interesting to try to follow up on this conversation or hidden conversation or the way she does not talk about Latin America, only in private letters and so on. It might be very interesting to think also through Latin America on Arendt. Thank you.
So shall I begin? Okay, thank you for your question. But yeah, since I never said that Arendt's account was contradictory, I said it was paradoxic and made a difference between these two ways of understanding it. I'm not sure if I followed up on your question. What I tried to say was, in a sense, what you said, that these three different accounts are complementary. First, there are the great tragedies of modernity. As the famous Arendt scholar Margaret Canavan has argued, all of Arendt's thought is based on these tragedies. And it was these two tragedies that led her to rethink the basis of politics. And like you said, they are complementary and intertwined in this sense. But what I try to illustrate in this presentation is the more particular way in which they are connected. Unfortunately, I only had 20 minutes. This is a really short version of an article that will be published at some point. I hope if you read that, then you will be more satisfied.
Yes, it's my turn. And yes, in a lot of scientific works, Latin America ignored, but that was the reason in 20th century. Actually, because we had two different sides that had influenced Latin America, about USSR and the United States, because half part of Latin America was under influence from United States, from influence from USSR. And the second reason why I think that were ignored, because everybody outside think about reconstruction after Second World War. They have problems inside of their country, and to be involved in other problems somewhere so far away in Latin America, for them that was not actually, I think, and that is the reason why a lot of scientific researchers ignored this problem, what happened, and about Hannah Arendt. And I took essay because that was they had a lot of connection with politology, different things like power, authority. It's more complaining in connection with situation. Yes, I told that it's like we had a military dictatorships in early 13th, but it's different in different countries. Because, for example, in Cuba we had revolution before, and we had a dictatorship in Cuba in early 20th century. And maybe later I will write another work with the connections different. Yes. Works of Hannah Arendt. Thank you for your question.
I think that if we want to stick to the program, and I hope that we won't, we have time for a little two questions or one short question.
Yes, we still have time.
Okay, so if there is any other questions. If not, if I may add a question about tragedy. If it is not tragic, then we can ask if it is not melancholic. Because as you said, she was thinking about those who had lost. And if it is not this Benjaminian frame of producing the image of history, looking backwards on the catastrophes. If it is not some kind of a double thinking about modernity that is still intertwined.
Yeah, well, I think in one of the earlier presentations, someone took up this Benjaminian figure of the Perlentaucher, of the pearl diver who dives into history and seeks for those treasures which, after the end of metaphysics, now lie somehow isolated. Yeah, that's definitely what Arendt does. She dives into history in order to readopt ideas that could be useful in terms of understanding politics of the present and politics of the future. That's why she also chose this famous motto from Jaspers to her work on the origins of totalitarianism, which is something like, do not like, I only know it in German. Or maybe I don't know it after all. But it's a motto which basically describes that everything comes down to being present in the current situation, and you can't simply be a conservative and rely on the ideas of the past, nor can you be a utopistic thinker who has all the solutions ready. So if this is melancholy, I don't know. Now we have lots of different words. We have spoken about contradictions, about paradoxes, about tragedies, about melancholy. Which one is the best to describe the general way she interprets history? I'm not sure if there's any single one. I argued in this one that it would, perhaps paradoxality would be something that describes it in total. I'm not sure if I can answer this question any better. I can go on and chatter about Arendt, but I'm not sure if it will bring anything new to this discussion.
If you have still some time, so we are still waiting for questions.
If there is no question, we can take
Yes.
a coffee break again. So there is
Yeah,
no
that's
possibility
So that's perfect solution to prolong the discussion. So thank you very much. Once again.
Yeah, we will continue it at 5 o'clock.